Anyway, so we have lots of questions now. I think we'll have to distribute them because there are some from the prior session too. How shall we go across it?
And start, we have some questions from
the previous fine. So Dr. Kelly, I have a question for you. You had stated that there are, can you suggest some tips and tricks as far as tank cleaning is concerned and the use of sterile liquid nitrogen?
Yes, thank you. So concerning tank cleaning, in all honesty, we have started here to decontaminate our tanks once in 5 years. And these are big liquid nitrogen tanks that are on the liquid nitrogen module. So we don't fill them up ourselves anymore. So they are automatically filled. Now, the thing is that when you have tanks that have automatic filling, you have a lot of electronical steering of the tank, and it's very good for those tanks to actually every year, but that is something that is quite difficult, but that we do it at least once in 5 years to really dry out your tanks so that the electronic devices are dried, and then everything can be decontaminated and filled again. We do it with a specialized firm. So I would recommend not to try to do this on your own, because you really need to take care of the fact that after decontamination, the tanks need to dry out so that all of these disinfection agents are out of your tank so that you do not damage your material. That's one. And two, sometimes you need extra tanks so that you can put your material into another tank. So you really need to do this together with a specialized firm. It's quite expensive and it takes time. You
correct.
do this in 1 day.
Yes.
But it's worthwhile.
Thank you. So Dr. David, one question for you. As far as the initial equilibration media is concerned, suppose a patient has 15 or 20 embryos and in the initial, the media volume is 400 microliters. So in that, how many embryos could we accommodate? Or have we to prepare two separate plates, 10 in each, or something like say 5 in each? What is the actual carrying capacity of the 400 microliters equilibration media?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'll be upfront and say, I'm not sure I know exactly what the answer is, because it will vary depending on individual labs, setups and conditions. The optimal way really is to use one drop of medium for each carrier, so that you absolutely get the best possible conditions. So if you're putting one blastocyst on a carrier, you would take one blastocyst through. I think what you would then have to do is make a decision as to whether you reuse that drop of medium based on timings, whether you perceive that the quality of that medium has deteriorated in any way. So, for example, I showed the effect of equilibration time on the mass of the drop over time. If you can show that that hasn't been affected too badly,
because
and you've maintained the right temperature.
Yeah, because I have seen people, some start with 200 microliters, some start with 400 microliters. So according to that, definitely the osmolarity is going to affect.
Over time,
yes,
they will all change over time, absolutely.
And as you said, the surface to surface area versus the volume ratio will be definitely differing from a blastocyst to an oocyte to an embryo. So there again, the number of the contents will be directly proportional to the exposure and the efficacy.
Yeah, there's a number of things that come into play. There's the equilibration time depending on, for instance, in a blastocyst, if you artificially collapse the blastocyst, your equilibration time may only be 5 minutes or so. If you don't artificially collapse and you're vitrifying a fully expanded blastocyst, the exposure time to the equilibration medium will probably be much closer to 15 minutes. And therefore, the quality of the medium over that time will be different between those two scenarios. So that's just another confounding factor.
Okay. And sir, one more before I just log out is in vitrification, I have seen many results initially come positive, the patients are happy, and maybe after a few days, the level of the beta acids just crash down. So where does the problem lie? Exactly. It's the endometrium receptivity or our suboptimal doing of the procedure. Well, it's a little lacuna. We are still not able to follow that.
Yeah, that's a whole day course covering covering that question, because I think in situations like that where you're getting a positive HCG that then doesn't progress to clinical pregnancy.
Rajvi, doctor, just 1 minute. So one more question.
Yeah.
There are different companies who suggest different steps. Now, certain companies are suggesting that the warming is to be done under room temperature without the heating stage, whereas certain companies advocate a heated stage. Now, why this dual conflict of interest?
Yeah, the instructions for use that you get with different manufacturers' kits will be based on the data that they use to register the kit. So as I mentioned in my presentation, you should always work on the basis that the kits have been validated by the manufacturer in some way. And you'll find differences between kits, whether they advocate 37 degrees or room temperature, both in vitrification and equilibration, but also in the warming and rehydration. The only one that's consistent is the first transition from liquid nitrogen to warming medium, which is always 37 degrees. Some kits then continue at 37 degrees and some rehydrate at room temperature, but you really should stick to the advice given by the manufacturer.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Ethiraj, one question for you. One person has asked the nice one: developmental potential of vitrified day 3 embryos. We know that human gene expression first occurs between the 4 and the 8 cell stage of pre-implantation development. So does the process of freezing and thawing at day 3 compromise the developmental potential of the embryos?
Yeah, okay. This is what I have shown in the slides.
Exactly.
That we have seen that it is not compromising. It is not compromising. So we can get almost like 50 to 55% pregnancy rate per transfer from these vitrified day 3 embryos. So it's very clear cut. So it is not compromising, but whereas it compromises on the day 2 embryo. So that's why we think that maybe after this embryonic block or the shift in the genomic control is transferred, I think day 3 embryos are less susceptible to such damages.
And one last question to all of you. There was one article in one magazine or in nature.com that high concentration of this cryoprotectant induces changes in human cellular processes and epigenetic landscapes in vitro. So later on, changes in the next filial generations down the line. Is it something a cause to worry, or we are just okay with it?
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to this, because this is something developed very recently. This idea came about. But so far, with whatever information that we have, I think it is still quite safe to practice vitrification. In fact, it's, I think, safer than slow freezing. But anyway, whether it's slow freezing or vitrification, we haven't seen any kind of abnormality that is increased because of these two techniques in these IVF-born babies.
Anyway, thank you very much. Rajvi, you can take over.
Yeah. So, Dr. Nalini, there's a question for you from the last session, and they would like you to elaborate a bit on the random start protocol for cancer patients.
Well, it's totally out of the context of what we're doing. However, basically in the random start protocol, what it suggests is that you can start stimulation at any phase of the cycle, be it the follicular phase or the luteal phase. And the trick is in the starting of the antagonist. You start the antagonist when the lead follicle, you discount a dominant follicle of 13 or 14 because you're concentrating on the second wave of follicles that is being produced in the cycle, and you're giving your gonadotrophins to grow those follicles. So when those follicles reach about 12 millimeters or more, that's the time you add antagonists. So your lead follicle, by that time, it may have already ovulated, but the progesterone secretion from that is not going to compromise the development of your the follicles that you are aiming at. So that's basically what it is. And in the luteal phase, again, when you start stimulation, when you start your gonadotrophins, again, you are targeting a second wave of the antral follicles which are developing, and the progesterones which are already high in the luteal phase, again, are not going to compromise the development of these follicles, the estradiol levels, the growth of the follicles, the size of the follicles has been seen to remain absolutely the same as when we would do stimulation starting in the follicular phase. However, the thing that I would like to point out, and it's not pointed out enough, is that the luteal phase stimulations always take much longer than your follicular phase stimulations. If your follicular phase stimulation would be the starting from day 2, it would be about 9 days. If you're starting a little later in the follicular phase, it could perhaps be 10 days, but the luteal phase will definitely be a couple of days more. So that does happen. And though the number of follicles, mature follicles or oocytes you achieve would be the same, but the stimulation definitely is a little longer. But no, not to worry about the corpus luteum or the progesterone levels. They do not interfere with the growth of the second wave.
Thanks, Dr. Nalini. Since you are on the move, I'll just take all your questions quickly.
Okay.
So there is one more. They're talking about what are the reasons for dark and granular oocytes. You talked about that. Is it just stimulation related, or are they post-mature oocytes?
No, they're not necessarily all post-mature oocytes. You have granularity in the cytoplasm, and this is of varying degrees. A mild granularity, then that has been seen to compromise. So it has been correlated to the amount of gonadotrophin that is used for stimulation and also to the increased pre-ovulatory progesterone levels.
Okay. So would you say that if there is an excessive use of LH, or in cases where you have used HMG, you expect more granular oocytes?
No, not at all. In fact, studies have shown that where LH is added, you have less dysmorphism than when in cycles where only recombinants are used. In fact, if somebody, maybe they didn't hear the lecture, the first part of the lecture, both the studies done on oocyte morphology suggested that with recombinant, and more dysmorphic oocytes than you have with the addition of LH.
How does the low progesterone levels decrease pregnancy rates?
Are we talking about luteal phase, or you're talking about?
No, I presume they're talking on, the bell curve that you showed.
Sorry?
The curve that you showed, that there is excessive progesterone, more than 1.5 or low progesterone.
That
Jatin showed it.
Now,
Okay.
the only thing that I'll have to say about that there is just, I think, one odd paper which showed that, the pre-ovulatory or low progesterone may matter. In fact, when we started stimulation with a low pre-ovulatory progesterone and pregnancy. So I don't know whether to agree on that, because there aren't enough papers to suggest that.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Nalini.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just one more question has come to me right now, and that is to all our vitrification specialists. And the question is that the genome stands different in an oocyte, in an embryo, in a blastocyst. Then how come in the initial equilibration media is the same for all? Doesn't it compromise it? It's somewhat of a, I think, cell molecular biology level.
Actually, if you study the composition of vitrification medium or a slow freezing medium, particularly with the slow freezing medium, we used to see a difference in the composition between oocytes and embryos, and particularly cleavage stage embryos and blastocysts. But when it comes to vitrification medium, because of their high concentration of all these cryoprotectants, and they are well validated, as David suggested, these are studied and then standardized to achieve the maximum potential or maximum survival rate of these. So this one works very well, even though they are the same system for oocytes or cleavage stage embryos or blastocysts. But with some of the manufacturers, I do see a small difference in their composition.
So one last question, Dr. Kelly, can you just suggest me some guidelines on the tank cleaning and the maintenance, which is very important? I would feel so. Some website reference or some link or something which I can share it with much of the audience who have been asking me right now. Okay, what are the guidelines for tank cleaning? Because I'm sure this is the thing which has not been touched up that much with an authenticity like rest of the protocols which we follow.
Yes.
You can share it with the society, ma'am. Maybe they can forward it to me.
Yes, I in the talk that I'm giving tomorrow, I actually provide a link to a guide on safety and quality of tissues and cells.
Okay.
issued by the European Council, and it's freely downloadable. So if you look at my slide, last slide of my talk tomorrow on transportation of embryos, you will have that link.
Okay.
The thing is that you have to, if you ask your commercial tank people, they will say every year. But in my opinion, that's very, very hard to do because we have, when we did our dance of the tanks, we call it 5 years ago, it took us about 3 months to get everything cleaned. So it takes quite some time. It's a huge effort of your team also to keep, focused. Where is everything now? We have changed it from one tank to another. They have to, so it's not something that you do on a yearly basis. So in my opinion, for the big bulk tanks, I would do it once in 5 years. For the little GT tanks, if you have some to spare, you could do it on a yearly basis, but then you have to take into account the cost. So that would be my guidance to all of you. For the GT40, so the old ones, I would do it once in a year. But for the big ones, I would do it once in 5 years. If the operational logistics and the costs are doable for your center, of course. Yes. Nowadays, just to add a remark, there are some commercial systems where you have actually a completely closed tank, automated tanks that are filled automatically. You don't have to open them at all. There's a robotic system on top of them. They cost, of course, a lot of money, but there you have a completely closed system that there cannot, nothing can come in anymore. Okay. So maybe in due time we will all use those kinds of tanks, and then a regular decontamination will also be something that maybe moves a little bit further on in the time. So that's my answer to you.
So ART lab management is willpower versus bill power.
Yes.
Right?
Or girl power.
Or girl power, very true. That's true. Anyway, so Dr. Rajvi, we end over here?
No, there are some more questions.
Okay, sure.
We can take some more. I think we have 15 minutes more.
Okay.
This question goes to Dr. Balaji. If we wish to go for blastocyst preservation, would you recommend early or an expanded blastocyst?
Yep, I do.
Yep, now it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Practically speaking, I freeze blastocysts in early stage as well as expanded. It's actually depending on what is there the next day. So that's what decides, and there are kind of logistic issues here. So when we do this, we do see that they survive equally, and then the potential is also the same for both of them. But when it comes to early blastocysts, maybe we have to thaw them earlier than the expanded blastocysts. So generally for expanded blastocysts, we warm them about 2 to 3 hours before the transfer. But whereas for these early blastocysts, we may warm them evening before if the transfer is done in the morning. I don't see a difference between them.
So it's more of what's convenient to you at that particular point.
Can I just add to that, Dr. Rajvi?
Sure.
That will also impact your equilibration time, of course, because with the size of the blastocele, you need to equilibrate the blastocele fluid as well. So one of the difficulties with blastocyst vitrification potentially is that you need to potentially alter equilibration time depending on the size of the expansion status. So it's just worth factoring that in.
There is a question that is sort of follow-up. Thawing a day before the embryo transfer may sometimes give us embryos that progress ahead slower. Do these embryos lead to any pregnancy? I wonder what they're saying, they're progressing ahead slowly, but possibly they mean that they are not growing at the rate that they would in a fresh cycle. So the warmed embryos. So do you want to comment on that, any of you?
I think it's if we take blastocysts as a first example, I think it's pretty common practice now to vitrify day 6 blastocysts, but then transfer them as if they were day 5, and that actually seems to give quite variable results. There are some nice papers showing equivalent pregnancy rates, but also, at least anecdotally, labs have reported to me that they don't see the same outcomes with day 6 compared to day 5. The day 3 ones are more interesting, I guess, because if they're slow embryos, they're already slow embryos and they're compromised in some way, potentially. So I think Dr. Balaji's data with the showing the relevance of the cell number on day 3 is quite interesting. And the suggestion there, I think, is that slower embryos on day 3 are already unlikely to perform as well as the ones that are 6 cell or beyond. And I'd be interested to know, Dr. Balaji, whether you tend to do your vitrification on day 3 late on day 3 or whether it's early on day 3, because that can have quite a big difference on what you see in terms of stasis.
Oh, yes. Actually, like what I mentioned before, we tend to freeze or vitrify the embryo soon after the transfer is done. Or if there are freeze all embryo cases, generally we freeze them around the noon or afternoon's time. So that's where. So we can call it, it's neither early or not later. It's like kind of mid day 3.
Question to all of you. What is the percentage of day 3 embryos which culminate to blastocyst?
Okay, I showed that's about 55% of them become blastocysts.
So the rest undergo a cell block or a maturation arrest?
Yeah, okay. They actually don't undergo cell block because they go beyond the cell block. They may get arrested around the compacted stage.
The reason being?
Okay, that's their developmental potential. They couldn't take the stress more.
Okay. So that means even during the fresh transfer, we have to wait till that certain slot of time where all those hurdles are overcome, in a nutshell.
That's what the literature also suggests, and scientists also believe in that.
So otherwise, if we go, I think it would be tantalizing to something like 60 or 62 hours or something of that sort, right?
Yeah,
from the time of injection or insemination.
Yes, generally, yes. The cell number should be related to when the ICSI or insemination was done.
Okay, fine.
The ESHRE has given a nice guideline on this.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Balaji, there's this question specifically for you. How long do you culture? For how many hours your warmed day 3 embryos?
24 hours.
So it goes back at the morula stage.
Morula.
Yes. Okay. And then there is one more. Dr. David, this is more of a practical question, and you have given those graphs talking about volume. So wouldn't it be more logical to just have larger volumes in your equilibration medium to be relatively less stressed about osmotic changes taking place? So what if you just use 400 and 500 microliters? I mean, it's not that much.
Yeah, and it's interesting again if you look at even the instructions for use from different companies, there are protocols that vary from 20 microliters to 1 mil. And what we know is that there are labs reporting very nice results, even with the 20 to 50 microliter volumes. And I think that potentially distorts things a little bit because those labs perhaps have the benefits of very tightly controlled conditions when they're vitrifying at an absolutely ideal time point. What we generally see is that the larger volumes give a more robust system because the condition of the medium is easier to control. And what we've seen in teaching vitrification is that labs, when they start, find it easier to control and get good results with large volumes. But as we're all aware, that adds to the cost. If you use large volumes, it can be more expensive. So it's finding a sweet spot between adding expense and making sure you maximize the efficiency of the system, which is why that 300 to 500 microliter volume is probably about right for most conditions.
We can be a little stingy with the vitrification medium, use lower volumes. But in equilibration, and this question always comes up in embryology about cost when it comes to use of culture media or vitrification media. And it's very difficult for me to comprehend because the actual costs involved in the ART lab, running cost, I'm not talking of the infrastructure or the equipment, but is nothing compared to the cost of the hormonal stimulation. So I feel that it's time we realize that, the whole thing is being done to get good embryos which lead to pregnancy.
I think we might have had this conversation before, Dr. Rajvi. giving an extra day of stimulation is far more expensive than most of the consumables in the lab.
True.
And still the first thing to be blamed is the media, right?
Don't start me.
Dr. David, you have been training lots of people. And what would you say for a fairly skilled embryologist is the learning curve for vitrification? Because whatever said and done, it takes a little time because we all say we are doing vitrification. But in reality, the vitrification of an experienced person and a vitrification of a new person, it's all under the quotes vitrification, but it's going to be very different. So what would you like to say is the optimal time duration for an embryologist to be good with vitrification?
Yeah, that's another tricky question. I'll mention three things if I can very quickly. I think people need to focus on loading technique, particularly with open devices, being sure that they control volume. The warming step from liquid nitrogen to the first warming medium. And the third thing I would say is that rather than, for instance, define a number of cases you have to do during practice, there are some really nice papers that demonstrate learning curve summation as a model to show that people acquire competence. And I'll put a link to the paper in the chat box, because that's a really nice way of determining proficiency, but also making sure it's kept ongoing.
Okay, one last question to Dr. Kelly. I have to end this, but I can't resist. You have elaborated on, how difficult it is to clean the liquid nitrogen, the large liquid nitrogen cans, the Devars, and you say 5 years, and that too by professionals. What if we were not to clean them and we have not had any accidents, things are going well? Would you say leave them alone rather than messing up?
Yeah, that's a good one, especially the tanks where you have vitrified oocytes in. In all honesty, I keep them closed. I don't disinfect them because I'm afraid to take the canisters out of them. So in all honesty, our GT40 tanks haven't been cleaned, and we have some, I think, over 20 years. But again, if you have these big bulk tanks that are on an electronic system who have valves and things like that, it's very good to have them dried out once in a while, simply because of the mechanism and the combination of the electronics. So rather than having them decontaminated for contamination issues, because we know we don't have them, or at least they haven't been shown yet or not published, I would have this service maintenance thing on your big tank, simply because it's really good for, it will enhances your lifetime of your big Devars who are on an electronic system. So yeah, for your little GT40, maybe leave them alone.
Thank you. That's a very practical answer. So we need to end this session now. And thank you very much for joining in. It was great learning.
Thank you all of you.
Thank you, Rajvi.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Nice meeting you.